Yes, and I am a certified G with a PhD. Not in professional wrestling, though. Anyway, like a lot of people, this is something that's in its early stages. And what I've discovered, sad to say, is that in researching this, I think I've come up with an outline for a book. So if you'll bear with me, I'm going to share the screen. And there it is. Everybody got it? Good. I'm kind of an old school person when it comes to professional wrestling. I was more framed by this in the 70s and 80s rather than the 90s. So you're going to see a lot of references to things that may be kind of old school here. So we start here. Just a second, sorry.
Come on, man.
There you go. All right. Here we have references to the stuff in the title. Mantaur, of course, Luchasaurs, and 2 versions of Warpig. Just for curiosity, does anybody know who this is that Warpig is posting? It's Pat McAfee. And we have my guardian angel for framing this presentation, Jeffrey Jerome Cohen's collection, Monster Theory, and a collection of horror writing with wrestling themes. So, what frames these notions is something from Stephen T. Asma. Artists convey moral visions. Audiences can reflect on them, reject or embrace them, take inspiration from them, and otherwise be enriched beyond the entertainment aspect. That's from Monsters and the Immoral Imagination, and that is really what the aim of this conference is, I think. Get us to reflect beyond the entertainment aspect, because that's really what we're doing here. And my reflection has to do with the way that professional wrestling has not only intersected with horror cinema, but also with the concept of monsters and the other. And in the next slide, you'll see this. There's a long tradition in Mexican genre cinema where we have professional wrestlers facing monsters, and then we get into some more contemporary sorts of things where you have Kevin Nash turning into a zombie and fighting a Kurgan zombie. And we then have, how shall we say this, professional wrestlers who are past their prime, fighting with zombies during a zombie outbreak, and yes, nearly everybody gets zombified. All right. And I think here is as good a place as any to invoke Bart. And that is, again, the quote that we all know: the virtue of all in wrestling is that it is the spectacle of excess. And you can certainly see from these grabs that there is plenty of excess going on. So, excuse me. Jeffrey Jerome Cohen has the lead essay in Monster Theory, and the essay is entitled Monster Culture 7 Theses. And it's, as you suspect, every part of that chapter deals with a different thesis related to monsters and othering. So the first one is the monster's body is a cultural body. And within professional wrestling, we see a lot of examples of this. This is where we get, excuse me, the use of xenophobia and racism. We have Killer Karl Krupp. We have the Iron Sheik and Volkov. We have Mr. Fuji and Professor Tanaka. But as we get more modern, the cultural horrors that the wrestlers embody are a little bit more topical. We have the gangsters here, with New Jack being famous for various types of promos that were in tune with the Rodney King beating, They constructed an angle where they beat Ricky Morton using that, and so on. And it got to the point where, as it says here, the views of the gangsters are not those of Smoky Mountain Wrestling or the station. In a more contemporary vein, we have Sam Adonis here, who wrestles in Mexico. And as you can see here, he's got Donald Trump imposed on an American flag, and he plays a Trump-loving foreigner. Obviously, he becomes a heel given where he is. All right. And, excuse me, one of the things that kind of ties in with this notion here is something that New Jack said in the recent Vice documentary From the Dark Side of the Ring. You've got to create something that you've never seen before. All right. That was counsel given to him by his trainer, Ray Candy. And the gangsters are what he came up with. All right. And as D'Lo Brown says in the same documentary, the gangsters were literally a microcosm of what was going on in society at that time. All right. So all of these creations, and there's many more, if you want to throw in the chat, I can't see the chat when I'm projecting my screen, but if you want to drop your favorite wrestling monsters into the chat, that would be cool. All right. What Cohen says beyond this is the monster's body incorporates fear, desire, anxiety, and fantasy. Pure culture, a construct, and a projection. All right. So these wrestlers all embody some sort of cultural anxiety, much like horror and genre films of a particular time. You could read Kendall Phillips's Projected Fears if you want to get more insight into how horror cinema is directed by the cultural anxieties of a particular time. All right, Mark Jankovic has another book on that as well. All right, so this thesis is pretty easy to suss out within the world of professional wrestling. Culture and cultural anxieties very often drive the creation of monster heels. Okay, moving on. This next one, here I go into my history. The monster always escapes. All right, excuse me. Cohen says the monster's body is both corporeal and incorporeal. Its threat is its propensity to shift. We've been hearing things already about Matt Hardy, Bray Wyatt, The Undertaker, teleporting, but I also prefer to think of this notion as connected to the essential repetition of Kevin Sullivan's gimmick that he started in Florida with the Army of Darkness, which he then took a similar form of this to Continental Wrestling, which was in Alabama primarily, and then it finally ends up in WCW with the Dungeon of Doom, with all these repackaged individuals that function as monstrous figures. All right. This, for me, the WCW appearance is an example of the escape and reappearance of the particular monster, Kevin Sullivan being the person who corrupts individuals. One of these individuals, for instance, this one right here, I believe it used to be Mike Davis, who fell under the spell of Kevin Sullivan and repackaged himself as an ersatz version of Dusty Rhodes called The Dream. This was in Florida in the 80s. All right. And then here we have John Tenta repackaged as the Shark, Brutus Beefcake as the Zodiac, Ed Leslie, and we have Meng. And Kamala didn't change his gimmick at all. All right. So once again, we have examples of the idea of the monster getting loose and then coming back. Moving on. The monster is the harbinger of category crisis. This is an interesting one for me. I've done work on this in other venues. Basically, what we have here is the notion of Monsters destabilize how we set up systems and categories, all right? When Ted DiBiase suddenly turned on the Junkyard Dog in the 80s in Mid-South, it represented a seismic shift for the territory, because up to that point, Ted DiBiase had always been a face that could be counted on, and now he is a heel who cheats and forms alliances with foreigners like Skandor Akbar, and the wrestling public is really, really upset over this. Transitioning to Stone Cold Steve Austin. Stone Cold Steve Austin, we cheer him, but he beats up his boss. How many of us could actually end up doing that? He destabilizes the category of boss worker sort of thing, and he embodies the impulses that we all have for really wishing we could tell our bosses what we thought of them, but we don't do it for any number of reasons. All right, and then lastly we have Bray Wyatt, who destabilizes the category of good and evil. They're one. This is the appearance and reality sort of dichotomy that drives much of literature, witness Jekyll and Hyde, werewolf stories, and so on. All right. So what we have then is a monster being a form suspended between forms that threatens to smash distinctions. All three of these individuals, in one way or another, do serve to contest those distinctions. We have a face going to a heel who then goes back to being a face. We have a heel who is cheered, and we have an evil figure who is cheered. All interesting. Next slide. Monsters dwell at the gates of difference. All right. This is one of the ways that professional wrestling has always captivated our imaginations with monsters. They've engaged the different. Raven being a philosophical sociopath, Mankind, the Missing Link, and Kamala. These are all examples of how wrestling has constructed and exploited the notion of difference. Cohen says, monsters are difference made flesh, an incorporation of the outside, the beyond. Monstrous differences tend to be cultural, political, racial, economic, and sexual. And we've been hearing a lot of ideas already about how the entrance of difference into professional wrestling makes for interesting discussions. All right. And so when we talk about difference, I think it will be interesting to see in what ways that difference is co-opted. In these examples, we see, excuse me, got a rough spot. We see examples of how that difference is used to create heels. But it might be interesting to see if we can create faces that are actually different too. All right. Thesis 5, the monster polices the borders of the possible. All right. Here we have monsters functioning as warnings against exploitation of the limits of knowledge, or exploration of the limits of knowledge. We have the angle between the Ultimate Warrior and Jake Roberts, where Warrior by turns ended up locked in a coffin, buried up to his head, and then bitten by Jake's cobra. This is the aforementioned Mike Davis morphed into the Dream, done so because he sought to consort with Kevin Sullivan, and Lucha Underground's Mil Muertes, who, as his legend says, survived being buried as a child by an earthquake. All right. All of these creatures, quote, all right, embody the notion of either being punished for transgressing or becoming monstrous themselves. Fear of the monster is really kind of a desire. One of the ways that we look at this is to think of how the bad is always interesting. Once you tell somebody don't look, they will. We rubberneck at traffic accidents, all right? As much as we want to look away, we can't. And the idea of having women be an embodiment of that fear is also one of the ways that monstrosity is created within the framework of professional wrestling. Witness Katrina, who, as she was later presented in Lucha Underground, had the properties of essentially being a ghost or a spirit. Fallen Angel here, Nancy Benoit in her early stages as the consort of the Army of Darkness, and the Undead Bride Sue Young from TNT, excuse me. All right, all three of these, and there are many more that we can consider, embody this notion of monstrosity and desire, whether it's sexual or spiritual or intellectual, having close proximity with each other. Last thesis. The monster stands at the threshold of becoming. This is where I bring up the notion of living your gimmick. All right. All three of these characters and many, many more became monstrous because of the importance of their gimmick to them. All right. Chris Benoit being undone by the use of PEDs. Same thing with Kerry Von Erich and the drugs, and the Dynamite Kid in terms of pushing his body beyond reasonable limits. By the, sorry, lost my train of thought. These wrestlers and others like them become the cautionary tale for wrestlers and audiences because of their, excuse me, their warnings that they sound about how, doing what needs to be done in order to be successful can in fact end up making you monstrous. So what does this mean for us? Well, there's a few things. Sorry, I think that was my time. Okay, just really quick through these. We have some new films coming out that place themselves in wrestling. Some of them are already done. Sorry, I missed one here. We have these documentaries that give us insight into wrestling and break kayfabe. I highly recommend The Trade if you don't know it. This is about Sick Nick Mondo, and it really sums up, I think, all the bad things about living your gimmick and what that gimmick can do to the next generation. So as I close, I always leave you with this. As always, somebody's got to do it. Might as well be me. Thanks for coming by. Close the screen.
All right. Thank you, Rocky. I know there's been a lot of comments in the chat with a lot of different ideas, and I'm going to guess people would love to hear your thoughts about the various characters that they've been bringing and various wrestlers that they've been bringing up.
Well, I'm seeing a lot of Cactus Jack. Yes, Bertha Faye, Monster Ripper in Japan. Nicole Bass, China.
Yeah. So
all right.
Please head on over there and have a nice conversation with everyone for us.
Okay. George Steele, yes, he was one of the earlier sorts of monsters, definitely with the green tongue and whatnot. So let's see, Sick Nick Mondo, yes. All right. I don't know about the connection to Moxley's promos. All right. But Kevin, I would ask if you'd seen The Trade And again, I recommend that for everyone in this group. It's a really, really, you know, nasty sort of thing to watch. I mean, seeing what he does to someone. There's a clip in there where he's it's not a power bomb. It's like a front held kryptonite crunch off a 2-story building through a table and light tubes landing on barbed wire. You know, really, really unsettling to watch that.